Hello, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We will be sharing our screen and starting the presentation at around 7:35. So for now, sit tight and we'll all wait a few seconds for the rest of the attendees to join. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's late for a webinar, so we're excited to talk today about Rhode Island's climate policy. There's a lot going on, and there are some action steps that you, Rhode Islanders and our members, can help us take so that we can make sure that some of this crucial climate policy gets over the finish line in Rhode Island. We'll be talking about all of that today, and now that it's 7:35, we'll get started. So before we begin today, some brief logistics. My name is Kai Salem. I'm the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers. Joining me today are Mal Scourin, who works on transportation policy as well as our Drive Green programs. Priscilla De La Cruz, our Rhode Island director, who represents us in many ways in Rhode Island, including working on community choice electricity aggregation, the chair of the Climate Jobs Coalition, which we'll talk about later, and she's also the president of ECRI. Priscilla does a lot with us. And today, everyone is muted to avoid background noise. You can send questions via chat box. Our questions will be answered at the end, but you can send them at any time so you don't forget them. Finally, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll make sure that you have the webinar link after the webinar is done so that you can send it to family and friends if they missed it, or if you just want to review it for yourself. So we're Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We were founded in 1982. In 2004, I believe, in Rhode Island separately. Our Massachusetts and Rhode Island branches joined, and we primarily work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island to this day. We have a number of programs that help our members make green energy choices. We also work on policy advocacy so that we're harnessing all that power we have as energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We've helped tens of thousands of our members access clean energy, and through our policy work, we're helping even more across Massachusetts and Rhode Island make sure that we have green, affordable energy in our states. Today, we're talking about Rhode Island, the climate crisis in Rhode Island, and the type of climate policy that is before us that can help address the climate crisis. Over the past 50 years, surface water temperature of Narragansett Bay has increased almost 3 degrees Fahrenheit. The climate crisis is here in Rhode Island. You may have your own stories of what's been happening. You might have noticed that there's not as much snow during the winter, although this winter might have been an exception. It gets hotter during the summer. Weather is weirder. The fishermen in Rhode Island have been noticing that the fish patterns are different. And in fact, our average air temperatures have increased the most of any state in the contiguous 48 states. That's on top of the fact that we have so much coastline here in Rhode Island, so rising sea levels threaten our homes, our natural resources, inland floods threaten our cities, urban heat island effects threaten our most vulnerable communities, especially those that don't have access or as strong access to healthcare, community services. Our most vulnerable communities are the ones that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate crisis. And so we need to think about equity and justice when we're doing all of this climate crisis work. So the climate crisis is here, it's impacting Rhode Island, and it's impacting our frontline communities first and worst. But the good news is that current policy proposals have the potential to accelerate our pace of climate action in Rhode Island. We know how to address the climate crisis here in Rhode Island. It's just a matter of having the political will and political power to do so. Today, we're going to be talking about these policy proposals that can get us to net zero carbon emissions in Rhode Island by 2050. They'll also ensure that we're centering our frontline communities while doing so and making sure that we have affordable and reliable energy systems for decades to come. So before we jump into everything, here is a brief overview, a cheat sheet per se, of the policy that we're going to be talking about today. We'll talk about Act on Climate, which is currently awaiting the governor's signature. We'll talk about our bill to get 100% renewable electricity by 2030, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is not yet introduced, but is all about making sure that we have clean transit options and are also reducing the polluting fuels in our transportation system. We're talking about energy efficiency and how we can make sure that we're reducing emissions from our buildings while getting more lower utility bills in our homes. We'll talk about appliance efficiency standards, which is also about reducing our utility bills while reducing water waste and reducing emissions. There are lots of other good policies that are on the table today or have not yet been introduced in Rhode Island, but are introduced in other states, or are just ideas that people have. We won't be focusing on those as much today, but this is just to say that even if we were to pass all of the policies we talk about today, we would not be done. And the climate crisis is huge. We'll be working on this for decades. Before we jump into talking about all of these policies, I will touch on how a bill becomes law. This is going to be very useful while we're talking about the nitty-gritty of where these bills are at in the legislative process. So the very first step, a bill starts as an idea. Usually during the legislative off-season, which is between June and January, because the legislative session here in Rhode Island starts in January and usually ends in June after the legislature has passed a final budget, and it closes for, that's the end of the session, it closes for the summer and fall. Over the course of fall or beginning of winter, advocates or Rhode Islanders or legislators think about their ideas for legislation, and they start doing the research and writing drafts of bills that will become a final draft bill the senator and representative introduces. A bill has to pass on both the Senate and the House of Representatives side. It's a bicameral legislature, so there's the Senate and there's a House of Representatives that operate separately. Usually a bill will be introduced separately in each of the Senate and House of Representatives and then pass through the legislative process on each side. On each side, after a bill has been introduced, a bill will have a committee hearing. It will be assigned to a committee. Often our bills are assigned to the Environment Committee, so that's Senate Environment Agriculture, or House Environment and Natural Resources. A committee hearing is when the merits and cons of a bill can be debated. So advocates for the and opponents for the bill, including members of the public, any Rhode Islander is able to call up and weigh in on the bill. They all make short testimony about the bill, and the legislators will listen and ask questions. After a hearing, there is usually a short window of time where the bill can be amended. The amended bill is called a sub A. If it's amended again, it's called a sub B, and so on throughout the alphabet. The bill or the amended bill is voted on in the committee. So this is the first of several votes. A bill needs to have a vote in the House or Senate committee that it has been heard in. Once the committee votes to pass it through to the full House and Senate, it will go to the full House and Senate, and then that usually takes about a week. It could take longer, it just depends on how, the politics of the bill. The House and Senate will vote on it. If both the House and the Senate have voted on it, then a weird quirk in Rhode Island is the bills have to go to the opposite chamber and be passed again by the opposite chamber. So that we're up to 6 votes, and then it goes to the governor's desk. The governor may choose to veto a bill, he may choose to sign a bill, or he may choose to let it pass into law without his signature. If all goes right, so a bill has received 6 votes total, and the governor has signed or otherwise not vetoed it, the bill becomes law. We have not seen this happen on a lot of environment or climate legislation here in Rhode Island. In fact, for the past several years, the legislature has passed 0 environmental legislation of any kind, and it has been since 2014 that we saw any type of major climate legislation. However, just last week and the week before in the Senate, we saw the Senate pass the Act on Climate and the House pass the Act on Climate. So we're actually seeing the Act on Climate move through this process. Now we'll talk a little bit about the Act on Climate. Many of you may have heard of this bill already, but the Act on Climate would make Rhode Island's carbon emissions targets mandatory, economy-wide, and in line with the latest science. Rhode Island has had carbon emissions reductions targets since 2014 when the Resilient Rhode Island Act passed. The Resilient Rhode Island Act set carbon emissions targets including 80% reductions from 1990 levels by 2050. However, these targets were not mandatory, so we've kind of seen the government, since the law has passed, the government has just said like, oh, we don't have to meet those targets, which means that they have not put in place the necessary policies and programs that we would need for us to get on track to meeting net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Recognizing that the Resilient Rhode Island Act has not done enough to get Rhode Island on track to addressing climate change, advocates have worked for the last few years, really close to since Resilient Rhode Island was passed, to make these carbon emissions targets mandatory. This year, the bill was updated to include targets that are in line with the latest science. So the new carbon emissions targets are 45% reductions by 2030, or actually 40% by 2030, and net zero by 2050. This bill would work because it would make sure that the government has to follow the law to create policies and programs to get us to net zero by 2050. If the government doesn't look like it's on track to doing so, any Rhode Islander would have the opportunity to litigate, and the result of that litigation would be that the government has to put in place those policies and programs. This would not result in a huge spate of litigation because there's no other reward to Rhode Islanders. There's no cash reward or anything like that to doing this lawsuit. So really the only reason to do it, we'd really only see the lawsuit in the rare case that the government is failing to meet its goals. In addition, Massachusetts has had a law like this. It's called the Global Warming Solutions Act since 2008 and has worked really, really well. We've seen the Global Warming Solutions Act in Massachusetts drive its climate policy to become really mature. Governor Baker, a Republican governor, just signed a brand new climate bill into law last Friday. It has produced a strong and growing green energy industry. It has led to #1 ranked energy efficiency programs, a huge amount of solar and wind. This bill is working really well in Massachusetts. And in fact, they had to use that litigation clause back in 2014 when Green Energy Consumers and Conservation Law Foundation teamed up with some other organizations to sue the government to get them back on track to reducing their emissions. We want the ability to do that in Rhode Island so that here in Rhode Island, we can see the same type of success from our climate policy. So that's what Act on Climate does. A little bit later, we'll talk about how you can make sure that this law finally passes into law rather than just stopping at this phase where it's a bill awaiting the governor's signature. So how can we possibly meet these emissions targets? It seems ambitious, going to zero emissions by 2050. That's what we'll talk about for the rest of this presentation. Along the bottom of the slide, you can see a graphic from Rhode Island's DEM about where all of our emissions in Rhode Island are coming from. The biggest sector by far is transportation. Almost 36% of our emissions come from transportation. That includes trucks, planes, but most of those emissions are coming from our personal vehicles here in Rhode Island that we're using for commuting, going to the grocery store, everything else. The way to address transportation is to create more incentives in charging for electric cars. Gasoline-powered transportation, gasoline and diesel-powered transportation can never be fossil fuel free. The best way to address transportation is to move towards electric public transit, which reduces emissions all on its own, and also to make sure that all of our vehicles are electric and running on electricity that is produced on solar and wind. Mal will later talk about Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is our policy proposal for starting to reduce emissions from transportation. So the next important sector is electricity. Almost 26% of our emissions come from electricity, but electricity is even more important than that because the best way to reduce emissions from all the other sectors is to electrify, and to reduce emissions in an electrified world, we need to make sure that our electricity is 100% renewable. To make sure that our electricity is renewable, we can invest deeply in energy efficient appliances and buildings that are cutting down our overall electricity needs. We also want to pass a 100% renewable energy standard that would implement Governor Raimondo's 100% by 2030 goal. We'll talk about the 100% renewable energy standard a little bit later. We need to expand our investment in offshore wind and solar in a way that makes sure we protect our most important natural resources. Offshore wind is one of the most exciting components of our growing green energy economy. There is a huge potential within offshore wind to produce the energy that we need to electrify all of our sectors of the economy, as well as make sure that it's 100% renewable. A recent report from Environment America revealed that we have many more times the potential to produce electricity than we would need here in Rhode Island, even in a fully electrified world. Some may have seen the Biden administration over the weekend. President Biden announced a new commitment to offshore wind. This is going to be the future of our electricity system, and Rhode Island and states around the region are already moving towards it. Finally, we have a really big sector. Let's see if we can go back to that page, and that's heating and cooling. So we group all of these next sectors, that's residential heating, industrial, commercial heating, and natural gas distribution, under the building sector. That's all about the emissions that come from heating and cooling our homes, primarily with natural gas here in Rhode Island, but it also includes the emissions from cooking. If you have a natural gas stove, it also includes the emissions from oil and propane heating systems and other heating systems. The ways to address heating and cooling in our homes is to make sure that our homes are as weatherized and insulated as possible, so they have as low heating and cooling demands as possible, to ensure that we're moving towards net zero building codes and standards so that future homes are built in such a way that they do not need any energy to heat and cool them, or if they do, that it can all be powered from renewable sources. And finally, to move our building heating systems towards electrified heating systems, that's high efficiency electric heat pumps, which are tested to work in cold climates like ours, and also, depending on how they are designed, can be no more expensive than buying a new heating system from a fossil fuel source. So now we'll get into some of the policies that have been proposed already that would do everything that we're talking about here. Number one is get to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Currently before the General Assembly is a bill that would update the renewable energy standard from 30% by 2030 to 100%. Some of you may recall that Governor Raimondo had an executive order in January 2020 that announced a goal to get Rhode Island to 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and kicked off a stakeholder process to figure out just how we would do that. The Brattle Group and the Office of Energy Resources got together. We participated in that stakeholder process. A lot of other folks did as well. And we all concluded that the number one strategy to getting to that goal is to adopt the 100% renewable energy standard. The renewable energy standard is a policy that we've had in Rhode Island since 2004. We were a leader in the country in adopting this policy. It sets a minimum percentage of our electricity every year that must come from renewable sources. It requires the utility to buy that electricity and deliver it to our homes, and it rises every year. So currently, Rhode Island is about, I think in the high teens, somewhere around 15% of our electricity must be renewable, and we're set to get to 30% by 2030. But we can do a lot better. We know that because Rhode Island already has a surplus of electricity. I think we have a 15% surplus right now, and when new offshore wind projects like the Revolution Wind 400 megawatt project or the announced 600 megawatt procurement of offshore wind, when they come online, we'll have an even bigger surplus. In fact, we're on track to have 82% of our electricity needs possible to be met by in-state renewable energy by 2030. And yet our renewable energy standard is only slated to go to 30% by 2030. We need to raise our renewable energy standard just to keep track with the market. And while we're at it, we should raise it to 100% by 2030 because we can easily close that gap. This policy will make sure that we have an accountable and transparent way to do that, and that we ensure that we get to our 100% by 2030 goal. The next strategy is extending and strengthening energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, as you'll recall, is our number one strategy to getting to our low carbon goals in the building sector. And least cost procurement is the statute that creates our state energy efficiency programs. Least cost procurement is a really, really cool policy. What it does is it says that before investing in new electricity or natural gas supply, so before buying electricity from power plants or natural gas from natural gas suppliers out of state, the utility company must invest in energy efficiency measures. That's things like the free energy efficiency audits that you can get in your homes, incentives for upgraded appliances, free weatherization, all of the energy efficiency measures that are available through the utility run programs. And a small fee is charged on ratepayers' bills to pay for these energy efficiency programs. But the special thing about these programs is that for every dollar that a Rhode Islander pays into the programs, we're getting far more than $1 back in benefits. And that's how the programs are designed by law. The benefits come in the form of decreased utility bills, but also huge decreases in greenhouse gas emissions, increased comfort in homes, public health improvements, and a whole host of other benefits. Even if you don't participate in the programs, you're still getting benefits out of them. And that's because when your neighbor installs energy efficiency and starts using less electricity or less natural gas, that makes the whole system work better, it makes the system more reliable, and it makes the system less expensive for everyone because it requires less upgrades to the pipes and poles and wires that carry electricity and natural gas to our house. These have been the most successful clean energy programs in Rhode Island so far. They produce the majority of our state clean energy jobs, and they've reduced our electric demand 10% since they were instituted. These are so awesome, and yet they are set to expire at the end of 2022. So we need to extend and improve them either this session or next session if we are to continue getting the benefits from our state energy efficiency programs. That is why extending least cost procurement is one of our policy priorities this legislative session. We can also strengthen energy efficiency by passing updated appliance efficiency standards. Efficiency standards lock in water, waste, and emissions reductions by raising the minimum level of efficiency required in 18 products sold in Rhode Island. These are products like faucets, electric vehicle chargers, computer monitors, commercial fryers, and other restaurant equipment. So they're kind of weird products. They're the products that don't already have appliance efficiency standards, because most products in our homes already do have these standards. But these products are ones that the technology has improved a lot, and we're missing out on a lot of emission savings and utility bill savings by not already having these standards. And now I'll turn it over to Mal to talk about what we can do on transportation policy and our transportation policy priority.
Thanks, Kai. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mal Scoron. I'm a program associate for Green Energy Consumers Alliance. For the last couple of years, I've worked extensively on the Drive Green program, which is our program to help folks get into electric vehicles in place of gas-powered cars. Through my experience talking to people that have been able to make that transition, I use that to influence our transportation policy priorities and figure out how Rhode Island and Massachusetts can enable more people to make that switch. And so today I am really excited to be able to talk about a policy initiative that I think will be really helpful in supporting what the mission of the Drive Green program is, which is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI for short. The program is regional, so Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and some other states have signed on and will participate. And as Kai mentioned, this is a really important policy to pursue because transportation is currently the largest source of emissions in Rhode Island, and a lot of that is coming from passenger vehicles. So we really need to be able to have a way to enable people to make a low carbon switch to something else. The policy is also an opportunity to improve public health as well, because vehicle tailpipes are one of the leading causes of, or leading emitters of nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, ozone, and particulates that can exacerbate asthma and other respiratory conditions. This impact is particularly high for folks that live close to highways and where congested traffic tends to roll through. And so we see the impact of vehicle pollution particularly hits hard low-income populations and Black and Brown communities as well. So there's multiple reasons to support a program like the Transportation and Climate Initiative. So the program essentially can be broken up into three distinct parts. The first part of the program is capping pollution. Vehicle pollution tends to increase over time because people are driving more and more miles every year. And so step one is to put a limit on the pollution and start to really account for all of the carbon pollution and air pollution that comes out of tailpipes. We enforce this limit through allowances that measure exactly how many carbon emissions are coming out of vehicles every year. The second step to make sure that we account for this cap in pollution and to make sure that it declines over time is to require importers and suppliers of gasoline and diesel fuels to buy allowances to account for the fuel that they sell in state. So that not only helps us keep track of the pollution that's coming in and out of the state, it also helps us make sure that that cap declines over time as the program intends. And then finally, the last step, the most important step, in my opinion, of how the Transportation and Climate Initiative program works is that the revenue that's generated from the buying and selling of allowances is used to invest in clean alternatives to gasoline and diesel fuels. The program is expected to generate $300 million in revenue in the states that have already agreed to participate. And right now we are waiting on enabling legislation to move the program forward. If you can move to the next slide, please, Kai. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is a regional program, which is really important for a few reasons. Number one being that transportation doesn't stop at state borders, especially in a small state region like New England. There's lots of moving of goods and people across state borders. So it's really important to be able to design a policy that gets at the fact that, transportation is a regional issue. As I mentioned, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have all agreed to participate, but there are 9 other states plus Washington, D.C. that are at the TCI table, so to speak. And so those states are also informing how the policy is being designed so that they can eventually sign on and participate as well. The fact that this is a regional program is also particularly important for a state like Rhode Island, which is small, because it means that by cooperating and working with other states, Rhode Island is maximizing its impact. So the fact that Rhode Island has signed on early and is committed to participating is really exciting, because we're setting a good example for the rest of the region. And that means that we can overall address a larger chunk of emissions than just what's coming from Rhode Island. So it's an opportunity to be a leader and also have an outsized impact on the transportation issue that is a major problem in all of the TCI states. And the most important thing to remember is that while it would be really great to see more states sign on, and we anticipate that happening, each state receives the benefits of the program regardless of how many other states participate. So Rhode Island will still decrease emissions and see funding come in to address the transportation issue, even if no other states participate. So that's important to remember as well. Move on to the next slide, please. Cool. So as I mentioned, the most important thing to remember about TCI is that it enables investment in clean options that will make more mobility options affordable for more Rhode Islanders. So $300 million in revenue is expected to come to all of the TCI jurisdictions that are participating so far. But because money is allocated according to the amount of fuel that's consumed in each state, Rhode Island will receive $20 million a year out of that $300 million pot. That is not a lot of money, but it's a really good start, because we are way behind on making the kinds of investments that we need to make in order to ensure that people can affordably and reliably switch to a low carbon transportation option. So there are lots of good investments on the table, and the TCI money can provide a good start to make those things happen. Some of the things that Green Energy Consumers is particularly excited about are things like improved and electrified transit service. We're excited about that because transit tends to be used by the populations that are most overburdened and underserved by the existing system. So people that tend to live closest to highways and are overburdened by air pollution will benefit a lot from improved transit service. And since diesel is one of the worst contributors to poor air quality, getting diesel buses off the road in place of electric buses will do a lot for the health of the people that take the bus. Active mobility paths for walking and biking is also a really exciting investment. There are lots of good plans in Rhode Island, including the Transit Master Plan and the Bicycle Mobility Plan that have a whole list of shovel-ready projects that just need a funding source. And so we think that TCI money could be used well to enable some of those projects to move forward. And then finally, as I mentioned, Green Energy Consumers Alliance has been an early and active proponent of electric vehicles. And so we would love to see at least a portion of the TCI funding be used for electric vehicle rebates or public charging installations so that more people can access electric vehicles. In particular, since electric vehicles are lower cost to own, we think that this will be really important to allowing people to own vehicles that are more affordable and improve our carbon emissions in the state as well. So there's lots of good investments. $20 million is a really good start for Rhode Island to participate in the TCI program. And right now we're waiting on enabling legislation to be introduced in both the House and the Senate in Rhode Island to be able to move forward. Our neighboring states of Connecticut and Massachusetts have already done that. And once that enabling legislation is introduced, you can expect to see a lot more action and press coverage on TCI later in this session. But for now, I'll pass it off to Priscilla, who will talk about some of our other models for making green energy accessible to all kinds of folks.
Thanks, Mal. And just a reminder to folks that you can go ahead and use the questions box to write in and share any of your questions that we'll get to shortly. I'll be brief, but we wanted to go ahead and touch upon green municipal aggregation, also known as community choice aggregation or community choice electricity. So what community choice aggregation is, or our favored flavor, green municipal aggregation is a model that allows cities and towns to go ahead and aggregate the electricity supply for its residents and small businesses. So it really gets at both purchasing for the electricity supply of residents and businesses within a given community. The beauty of that model is that not only can it be used to drive down the cost of electricity and get more competitive pricing, but it could also be used to add additional renewable energy. And that's why green municipal aggregation is our favorite version of this model, because it really allows communities to have yet another tool toward climate action and really take control over where their electricity supply comes from. So I wanted to go ahead and also point out that we're talking about this model that we pioneered back in Massachusetts along with a partner, Good Energy, in 2015. It is now taking off in Rhode Island because we worked with Representative Deb Ruggiero out of Jamestown, representing Jamestown, to go ahead and make changes to the municipal aggregation law. So that allowed us to open the door really for communities that were looking for a model like green municipal aggregation. And the first four that really moved forward with pursuing this option are Providence, Central Falls, Barrington, and South Kingstown. And as of now, they have plans that have been introduced to the Public Utilities Commission. There are other communities that are following suit, like Newport and Portsmouth, that are developing their model. This graphic that you see here just points out the community choice aggregation model that adds the default of additional renewable energy. So when we say additional, that's above and beyond what's required by state law. So earlier, Kai talked about 100% renewable electricity and our renewable energy standard. That is what is mandated by utilities in terms of the mix that they provide coming from renewable energy. What we're talking about here are communities that are going above and beyond what the renewable energy standard requires and procuring on a voluntary way additional renewable energy and adding that to their community choice aggregation program. We are proud to say that in Rhode Island, communities are starting off with a default of 10%. The standard in Massachusetts for some time was an additional 5%. And usually we get asked, why 5%, why 10%? Well, that keeps it affordable for all members within a given community to add that additional renewable energy and still enjoy the rate stability and savings that come from aggregation. In terms of a consumer protection model and consumer transparency, there is a process for community members to opt out if they were to choose to stay with a competitor supplier for any reason, or are already with a competitor supplier, but they can also just choose to stick with their basic service that is being provided by National Grid, and not participate in the aggregation. Worth noting here, when we were looking at the previous slide, I emphasized that this is for supply. So National Grid will still maintain the poles, the wires, and still make sure that delivery is coming your way. So for a consumer, this is a very transparent and simple way of adding more options, providing rate stability, and adding additional renewable energy by also not changing how consumers already pay their utility bill and get their electricity delivered. So it's just really about being able to control what we can control now, which is that supply and where it comes from. Next slide, please. So wanted to share with you all a little bit about the climate mobilization work that we do. So the Climate Crisis Campaign is a project of the Environment Council of Rhode Island. And the Environment Council of Rhode Island is the umbrella organization for about 70 organizations, nonprofits across the state, as well as individuals representing about 50,000 Rhode Islanders. So early last year, the Environment Council of Rhode Island and its members made the council's decision to start a climate crisis campaign because it became very clear that Rhode Island was not where it needed to be in terms of taking climate action. We had gone about 7 years without passing a single piece of climate legislation, like we recently did with the Act on Climate that hopefully will be signed by the governor. So the Climate Crisis Campaign is just an immediate call to action to decision makers, legislators, and the government to really take the climate crisis serious and pass legislation to drive down greenhouse gas emissions, really secure a path toward a just and equitable transition to a green economy, and protect the places that we love, and really recognize that communities are already facing the burden of climate change and seeing those impacts on a daily basis. So if you want to learn more about the Climate Crisis Campaign, we encourage you to visit riclimatecrisis.org. You can also sign up to support the statement of the Climate Crisis Campaign. Next slide, please. So when we think about building momentum on climate action, there's many moving parts. And I love this diagram because it really shows all of the different components that we've covered so far. The policy making aspect, the advocacy work that we do, what happens at the State House, but it also shows your impact through individual action in participating, being engaged through our programs, and really taking advantage of green energy options. It also points out the need for campaigns and coalitions like the Climate Crisis Campaign and the unified voice that the Environment Council of Rhode Island provides to protect and enhance the environment. It also shows what we also need, which is community action, really the activism, the rallies that we recently just had a rally actually last week in anticipation of the House passing the Act on Climate Act to just show community support for these issues. And also from our end, building partnerships with different organizations to really amplify our message as we're working to advocate for all of these policies. And what's missing from here, but really folds into policy making, is also what happens at the municipal level. We just talked about green municipal aggregation and community choice, and really ensuring that municipalities and communities are also supported as we're making this transition to a low carbon future or a net zero carbon future like Kai talked about. Next slide, please. So in terms of forming partnerships that really amplify our work and our message, we want to share with you Climate Jobs Rhode Island. Climate Jobs Rhode Island was formed in 2021. Earlier this year, a coalition of labor and environmental groups working together to establish that just transition to a green economy in Rhode Island. So really recognizing together that strong nexus that exists between labor and environment, which is a green economy, and creating the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. And how can we work together to really ensure that Rhode Island is putting forward the policies that we need in order to work towards that green economy, as well as recognizing that no communities should be left behind as we're working towards the climate, to address the climate crisis. So really, how do we center economic, environmental, and racial and social justice principles as we're working to form this new green economy? And being very conscious that, frontline workers and frontline communities are impacted by the climate crisis, and really ensuring that no community, no workers left behind as we're creating the sustainable future. So there's a lot more in the works to come from Climate Jobs Rhode Island. Excited that the group formed by union, labor groups, and environmental groups have made the Act on Climate a priority, and now we're all working together to ensure to get that across the finish line so we can then work on the other exciting policies that Kai talked about earlier, and many more as well. Next slide, please. And now I am going to go ahead and kick it over to Kai.
Thanks, Priscilla. So as we wrap up here, we're returning to our policy cheat sheet. Here are all the bill numbers and where these bills are in during this legislative session. One thing I would correct is that the House hearing has already happened for least cost procurement. So we're waiting for upcoming hearings in the Senate for 100% renewable electricity, least cost procurement extension, and appliance efficiency standards. We hope that all of you join these hearings or submit written testimony to the committees in support of these bills. And if you are subscribed to our action alerts, then we'll make sure to let you know when those opportunities come up. So we need your help to pass all of these bills. The first and most important thing that you could do is contact Governor McKee and ask him to sign on to the Act on Climate as written and passed by the House and Senate. We are hearing that fossil fuel interests are pressuring Governor McKee into removing the portion of this bill that makes it enforceable. This would, kind of void the whole point of this bill, because the point of this bill is that we can actually keep our government accountable to climate policy. If we're treating these our climate targets like goals that are just goals that the state doesn't actually have to meet, then we're never going to get anything done on climate. We have to make sure that this policy continues to be enforceable. The bills as written and passed have been considered, debated, and fine-tuned by many, many stakeholders over the years. They were supported by the DEM and Office of Energy Resources. So we really want this bill to pass as written. We encourage you to send him a message or call the governor's office to make sure that he knows that as well. Stay tuned for future opportunities, as I mentioned, to weigh in on climate policy. You can also subscribe to our blog. We'll be posting a couple of blogs upcoming, probably this week, on both the Act on Climate and all of the other policies that we talked about today. You can learn more about all of our programs as well as our policy at greenenergyconsumers.org or sign on to our climate crisis campaign statement. We hope that you all stay engaged and on our policy as well as our programs, so that we can have your help in making sure that Rhode Island is fighting the climate crisis and transitioning to our low carbon future. And now we have a few minutes for questions. So I will stop talking, and Mal, I believe, will pass along questions to any of us that you have.
Hi, so I actually have a question for Mal related to TCI, a pretty good one. How much will be added to the price of gasoline, and will the added fee increase over time?
Oh, I love this question. This is such a great question. So yes, the policy is really designed around a 5-cent increase in gasoline when the program starts in 2023. But there are some caveats to that, so I will add them. The first is that 5 cents is a very small amount compared to the difference that you might see in different gasoline stations, even on the same road. So for example, I was driving in North Providence the other day on Mineral Springs Ave, and there can be, a Cumberland Farms station that is easily, 8 cents different from a Shell station just down the road. And so 5 cents is really within the marginal cost of doing business for a lot of gas stations, which means that to remain competitive, some gas stations and fuel suppliers may choose to not pass a single cent on to the consumer because it's worth it for them to be able to attract customers to their gas station compared to, another one up the road that totally passes that cost on to consumers. So many people, it's possible, will never see a difference in the price of gas. If the 5 cents is added on to the price of gas, we find that to be, a really manageable number. And in terms of the benefits that we receive out of the program, we get a lot more out of it. And so in general, the money that Rhode Islanders pay for gasoline is money flowing out of the economy. So those 5 cents will be able to stay in the Rhode Island economy and make sure that we can enable choices that allow money to stay here in Rhode Island. So the more people that switch to electric vehicles, the more that money spent on fuel can be spent here in the Rhode Island economy. So overall, we'll see a lot more benefits delivered to Rhode Islanders than what people pay for at the pump.
Great, thank you, Mal. And just a reminder, you can share your questions or comments via the questions box on your panel. And we'll go ahead and give you some time to go ahead and write out any questions or comments. We still have a few more minutes. Go ahead.
Update that I referenced but did not go into is the Massachusetts climate bill that Governor Baker signed into law on Friday. So Massachusetts is way ahead of Rhode Island. We already know this, but the Massachusetts law did a number of things, including dramatically expanding their offshore wind procurements, upping their renewable portfolio standard, which is their equivalent of a renewable energy standard, and also tying their energy efficiency programs to their climate goals. So for those of you who know that we work in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, there's a lot of ideas there that we can take into Rhode Island and hope to work with. But also one important way that we can point to Massachusetts here in Rhode Island is that the Massachusetts governor is a Republican governor. He is supporting these policies, and the Massachusetts climate policy passed overwhelmingly. Here in Rhode Island, with our Democratic governor and overwhelmingly Democratic House and Senate, we are seeing some pushback on what should be non-controversial climate targets, and we're going to be left behind by our region. And we hope that if you do contact the governor's office, that you can make the point that the world, our country, and our region in particular are moving ahead on transportation and climate initiative and climate action, and we will be left behind with the pollution and the fossil fuels if we don't act now.
Thank you for adding that, Kai. I will just add one quick thing to that, which is, so if Rhode Island does not participate in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, and Connecticut and Massachusetts do, it's possible that we would, still see the increases in fuel costs because of, that regional market for gasoline, but not get any of the benefits. So there is a real risk to not participating in these kinds of programs when they're regional and affect New England's entire economy.
And I've received another question that I'm happy to answer. Is anyone working on community choice aggregation in Cumberland? No, and we could use your help. So we've actually been, I should say we/I have been working with a colleague, Jamie Rhodes, representing Good Energy, to form small working groups within each community, really just comprised of folks that are interested in community choice aggregation and bringing it to their town, city or town. So please reach out. We're seeing that folks are organizing, whether it's in twos or groups of 3, writing letters, submitting them to their city or town council, getting the attention of the mayor, or town administrator. So we can work with you on all of the above, and helping you move aggregation forward in your community. And I'll also just give a plug, save the date for our virtual spring meeting on May 18th at noontime, and we'll be showcasing a video, like a 2-minute video about community choice or green municipal aggregation, just again to provide another tool to help you get the message out there that this is an option that communities can take advantage of. And I will go ahead and double check if we have any other questions or comments in closing. All right, no additional questions. Any closing thoughts, Kai or Mal? Look out for our blog about fun climate. Go ahead.
Stay tuned for our blog, and you can subscribe to our blog if you want the alerts right in your inbox. And we'll have more emails this week with follow-ups from this webinar. And if you have any additional questions, you can reach us directly at the emails listed on this page.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.